Chapter 8 Explanation of Mr. Johnson's Confession. Since you don't have Mr. Johnson's confession to view, I decided to explain it in detail. When Frank lured Mr. Johnson to the best spot to get the best recording, he asked him, "Did you really get $46,000 from the video store's bank?" Mr. Johnson said, "I got 46 G's. Then, in an emphatic manner, he said $46,000, speaking every number slowly. This was the amount that Mr. Johnson intended to get, but it may not be the amount that he actually embezzled, but it is the amount that he mentioned in the videotape confession. The video store believes that at least two of the large transactions at the end of Mr. Johnson's scheme might not have cleared. In the next part of the confession, Mr. Johnson tells Frank that he made one transaction in the amount of $8,000 and went on to tell Frank all the amounts that he forced through, which totaled $46,000. The $8,000 transaction that Mr. Johnson embezzled was the largest one. During the taping of Mr. Johnson's confession, he was so excited of what he had done that he was talking fast and moving around because he was in a hurry to go to the Mac machine. Before Mr. Johnson left, Frank asked him, "Why didn't you take more money?" Then what he said next didn't make sense to this author. Mr. Johnson went on to tell Frank that he wasn't sure that what was going to happen if he got caught, and if he did, he would only have to pay 10% of whatever amount he got. I think that he is confusing this 10% with the amount of bail that you pay if you want to be released until you appear before your arraignment. Did Mr. Johnson think that paying 10% of the money was going to justify his crime? No matter what, Mr. Johnson was so excited, he thought that he was going to be able to keep 90% of the money that he embezzled. I think that Mr. Johnson was suffering from visions of grandeur. Enough of this poppycock. Let's get back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession to Frank. In the next part of the confession, Frank asked Mr. Johnson how he got the money from his account. Mr. Johnson said that he went to his bank and withdrew $10,000 cash, no questions asked. And Mr. Johnson said that he didn't take more than $10,000 because a transaction report would have to be filled out. Mr. Johnson structured his transactions so that he wouldn't break the $10,000 rule law. Before I get back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession, I am going to explain the $10,000 rule. Congress passed this law in 1971 to make sure that the banks would have to file a report on transactions over $10,000. If the banks did not file this transaction report, the bank itself and the bank employee who engaged in the transaction could be prosecuted for violating the law. More recently, Congress passed a law that says if an individual designs or structures a transaction in such a way as to prevent the bank from filling out a currency transaction report, then that individual is violating the law. This is what Mr. Johnson did by withdrawing not more than $10,000. I don't know why Mr. Johnson didn't just withdraw $5,000 at a time. I guess he didn't want to draw suspicion at the bank, and he was probably afraid that if he didn't get the money as fast as he could, something might go wrong with his scheme. In other words, he withdrew the money as soon as funds became available, as fast as he could. Now back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession. Frank asked Mr. Johnson, "Weren't you afraid to walk out of the bank carrying $10,000 in cash. Mr. Johnson made a few hand motions and then said that he didn't come out of the bank waving the money in the air, saying, "Look what I got." At this point of the confession, Mr. Johnson is moving away from the camera. Then Frank asked Mr. Johnson what he did with all the money. Then he told Frank that he bought a nice car for $2,500, and he gave his mother some money to hold for him in case he needed it later. He also paid for a vacation for him and his fiancée, and also put money into 2 banks near his mother's home. Then Mr. Johnson went to the back of the video store and punched out. And you guessed it, went to the Mac machine to check his available balance. That is the gist of Mr. Johnson's confession, as I interpreted it when I viewed it several times. Remember that Mr. Johnson's confession was only about 3 minutes in length, and Mr. Johnson didn't know that what he was saying was being recorded, or he wouldn't have said what he did. The actual videotape of Mr. Johnson's confession is very clear. Isn't this ironic that Mr. Johnson rents videotapes, but he won't rent a videotape of his confession?